Hello, and welcome to the Family Histories podcast, the show for and about those of us who are sat quietly in libraries, archives, and spare rooms all around the world, tirelessly piecing together our collective social and family history. My name is Andrew Martin, I'm a family historian, and I'll be your host. In this episode, The Brother, we'll be hearing about a man whose time serving in the Pacific Ocean led to tragedy, and we'll be on the hunt for a man who abandoned his family in 19th century London. So, put down that old census return, grab a cuppa, and let's meet our guest. My guest today is a family historian and author who has spent more than 30 years in radio. However, you might recognise his voice as the host of, dare I say, a different genealogy podcast, which has run for more than a decade. So, before he quickly cuts me off and puts a record on, it's time to find out about my guest's extreme genes. Yes, it's Scott Fisher. Hello, Scott. Welcome to the Family Histories podcast.
Hi, Andrew. It's great to be with you. Honored.
And it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Now, we always start in the same place, and that is to find out what it was that first got you interested in researching your family history.
You know, that's a great question, and I'm always fascinated by the answers people give. But the one thing I've really learned is that people mostly get into family history when they've lost somebody, and they can no longer ask the questions that they've always wondered about. And in my case, by the time I was 21 years old, I had lost all of my grandparents, and I'd only really known one of them. My paternal grandmother died 24 years before I was born. Right. My paternal grandfather died when I was a year and 9 months. My maternal grandmother died when I was 6. And then my grandfather on my mother's side lived till I was 20.
Okay.
So I got to know him a little, but he lived on the opposite coast. I grew up in the East, and he was in Oregon on the West Coast. So we only saw him maybe every 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
And then my dad died when I was 17. I lost a brother when I was 8 and 2 uncles as well. So by the time I got married at 26 and started having a family of my own, it's like,
wow,
who are those people
Yeah.
that were in my life and are now gone? And so at 26 years old, I started getting deep in the weeds with that, and it just it changed my world. It gave me a lot of things to connect with them. Certainly with my dad. I mean, there were so many things I knew about my dad, but I didn't realize how much I didn't know until I started asking all the folks who had known him.
I guess having lost so many members of your family, where did you start with researching?
I started with my dad's side,
Okay.
because my mother's side was rather well researched. There was a great aunt who had done some work in the 1950s, and we had these charts that were all handwritten and scratched and all that were in the family. And my dad's side was the side I didn't know, and of course he was gone. So I think that was my initial great interest. I still had a 90-year-old great aunt who was living, who just before she died sent us a bunch of notes that told us about her grandparents.
Okay.
On his mother's side. They were all from Great Britain. They were all from England.
Right.
And then on my dad's side, that's where the research for me really began, because he was from New York City, as they say there. And so I started writing away for certificates. And the very first certificate I ordered was wrong. They sent me the wrong one. So I had to start all over again.
Oh.
And went from there, and I learned the names of my great-grandparents on my dad's side on the name line. So that's what got it started. It was just so fun to hold that initial document.
Yeah, I bet.
And learn what, not only the names, but also the occupation of my great-grandfather, what he did. So I wanted to know more about that. He was a merchant in the city, and he and his brother sold coffee, tea, and spice wholesale to grocers. So now I was trying to find out, well, where was this place? And, you know, one thing just kept leading to the next. And the other thing was I wound up in radio in Salt Lake City, Utah. And, of course, that's kind of the mecca for family history.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was doing morning radio. I was, the number one morning radio show in town for many, many years. But the show was over by 10, and we'd work on the next day's show after that. But before my kids would start coming home from school, I'd have 3 or 4 hours downtown. I could just drive over to the family history library and park for free in the street for 3 hours and just start working.
Perfect.
And so I learned, the old-fashioned way how to do things until I developed my rudimentary skills, I would say, in the 1980s. And then I started feeling that my levels were increasing when we got into the 90s.
So you really were going to basically the archive, and you were finding the different certificates and family documents. Were you lucky to have many photographs as well in the family?
My mother's side, yeah, but not on my dad's side. I had one set of great-grandparents, my dad's parents, and of course, many of my father, but didn't have any of his paternal grandfather or grandmother. I still don't have one of his paternal grandmother. It took me 30 years to find one of his paternal grandfather. And that was a story in itself. That was one of those insane things that it's just like, no, this can't even be happening. But I was pretty thrilled to have it. And then it led to 2 more because they were not identified elsewhere, but we were able to identify it because we'd identified the first one. And that was only 13 years ago.
Okay. It just goes to show that whilst you might have a whole load of questions, you can suddenly then find a source that then answers them later on.
Oh, well, yeah. I had pictures of this great-grandfather's parents 20 years before I found one of him. He was the only member of that family that there didn't seem to be a picture existing. So he turned out to be a New York City volunteer fireman in the 1850s and 1860s. I didn't know this until the early O's when digitized newspapers came out. And so there were these stories out there about how these the Veteran Firemen's Association, who were the old volunteers, they were the guys that used to, pump the handles by hand to put out the fires, to put the water up on the buildings. And they were considered very manly men, very heroic. They were in all the parades in the city for anything that happened. And I kept seeing his name. And with enough digitized newspaper information, I was able to determine, yeah, that's the same guy. It's not just somebody else with the same name. So as a result of that, I started to research this trip they had taken. They took an excursion from New York City to San Francisco in 1887.
Right.
105 of them.
Wow.
And they stopped in Chicago and St. Louis and Omaha, and they stopped in Salt Lake City too, right near where I lived. And so I was following all the digitized newspaper accounts from each town and what happened and what they did. And in the Salt Lake paper from 1887, the month after the trip, it was noted in there in an article that Mr. Andrew J. Fisher of New York City, one of the veteran firemen who recently had come through, sent a full-body photograph of himself to Mr. Jacob Alt, another former New York fireman who lived in Salt Lake, and he had a pub. And apparently my great-grandfather enjoyed his time at the pub, and there was, I think there was a family connection. I think Jacob Alt's brother was in the same fire unit in the 1850s as my great-grandfather.
Right. Okay.
So now I started looking for that picture to see could it be passed down from that man. And I actually found some descendants, but never did find the picture.
Oh.
But a friend of mine went to the Utah State History Department, and he actually found a photo of a New York fireman that was from that trip. Wasn't my guy, but from that we learned that there were little initials in their helmets. And so if I could find an AF or an AJF in a group photo, and I knew there was one out there, then I might be able to identify him.
Okay.
And they recommended that I go up to a place in the mountains to the east of Salt Lake called This Is the Place Heritage Park. It's a state park, and it's where the early Mormon pioneers came into the valley. And they have recreated the old Salt Lake City up there, the old hotels and horseshoeing places and lots of fun stuff, including the old Fireman's Hall, which actually still exists. It's kind of weird. They actually reproduced a place that still exists in Salt Lake City. I don't know why they did that.
Okay.
But in that place, they had all this old memorabilia from the Salt Lake firemen. And I went up there and they said, "Oh, we don't have any old scrapbooks. We really can't help you with that." But I said, "Well, great. I'd love to see it anyway." The place was closed that day, but they took me up there anyway and walked me through. And they had all this parade memorabilia up there from, the things that the banners that they would wave. And they had an old pumper. And I went up the stairs and there's this group shot of these firemen from Los Angeles who had come through. And then I went in and there was inside on the top floor, there was their old helmets and other pieces of equipment. And then there's a big picture of these guys who came in from Baltimore and Philadelphia. And finally, over here on this other side, there are the New York firemen. And I'd seen this picture online, kind of blurry. And I had checked with the New York Firefighters Museum, and they said, "Oh, yeah, we have that picture, but we don't know who any of these guys are. We don't have any names with it."
Oh.
So I'm looking at this picture going, "Oh, that guy looks like my dad. That looks a little like Grandpa. Gosh, it could be this one." But you don't know. You're guessing. It's 105, but I know that I'm looking at him somewhere. And so I'm looking over the picture and who took the photograph, and it turned out to be one of the firemen eventually. And at the bottom is this long piece of cardstock. And on it are these numbers, and next to each number is a name.
Oh.
And I'm like, wait a minute. Is this a key? And I look up on the picture, and written on the tiny little shoulders of each fireman in this big group picture is a number.
Oh.
And I found Andrew J. Fisher, number 91, in that picture.
Amazing.
Yeah, on the that's how I got my first photo of him. It was a tiny, tiny picture, but the newspapers came out to do a story on it, and they had a really outstanding lens that was able to get right in on it and make that work. I was beyond thrilled. I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is insane. I find a picture of my New York ancestor hanging in a wall in Salt Lake City where I live. I never imagined in my life I'd live out west, It's just the way my career had taken me.
It's almost destiny you'd find it.
Yeah. So there was an antique store in Massachusetts that was advertising online another group shot of the veteran firemen from when they had paraded in the Grover Cleveland presidential inauguration in 1885.
Okay.
And so they went and looked on that picture, and they found another picture of him on that as well, took a shot of it for me and sent it. So now I had two, and in both cases he had a fireman's helmet on. And then I had a half-second cousin in Connecticut, and he stumbled across a picture with no markings on it and had no idea who it was, but he was able to match up the fireman picture. It's the same person. So now I have three of them. How cool is that?
That's amazing to go from nothing to three.
I know. I still kind of scratch my head and go, how did that ever happen? Just crazy.
Rather envious of you there.
Once in a while, things happen like that, if we never give up.
Yeah, that's right. So from your family history, how did you end up doing radio? Did you take family history with you?
As far as radio went, my dad was the music arranger for the Ed Sullivan Show, which was the show that the Beatles first appeared on in 1964 in America.
Oh, okay.
And he was the music arranger for that show for the entire run. And before that, he was a musician on network radio back in the day.
Right.
And my mother actually had a talk show in San Francisco in the late 40s and again in Reno, Nevada. And so we had a radio club at my high school where they got 15 minutes of airtime every week on a little radio station in my hometown in Connecticut. And so I joined that club, and I wanted to do sports. I wanted to be a sportscaster because I was a big baseball fan. I wanted to be the voice of the New York Mets.
Okay.
And so I got to do, because there were two other guys who wanted to do sports, I got to do 2 minutes of sports every third week.
Wow.
So I had a lot of time to really practice and, get it down. And this is 1970 we're talking about, long, long time ago. And then I eventually got hired by that radio station when I was just getting started, setting up remotes. Went to college in communications where they had a great college radio station. I worked in New York City during the summers and in some other places. And I found that I just kept getting more and more opportunities and more money being a personality rather than doing sports. So that's just the way it kind of went. And that kind of career in America moves you all over the country. So I worked in Ohio. I worked in Miami, Florida, upstate Florida, before I found my way to Utah. I figured I'd be here 6 months to a year, do all my family history research, and move on to some other place. Well, I'm still here, and it's been, 41 years now that I've been in Utah.
And you're still doing your family history research as well.
Still doing my research, still haven't found everything.
So how did you go from sports radio and personality to then doing Extreme Genes podcast?
Well, that's interesting because, when you do a pop morning radio show where you're playing pop music and you're clowning around with your on-air partner and you're playing pranks on listeners and you're giving things away and telling stories and all that, you have a lot of time in between with music and partners who are talking. So, a talk show always seemed kind of daunting to me, and I wasn't a real fan of doing interviews. I got over my fear of it, though, when I interviewed Paul McCartney back in 1990, because he was my favorite Beatle.
Okay.
And we were on the phone with him for a few minutes, and he was just great, just the way he always appears, just wonderful and kind, and that gave me a lot of confidence. Then the next year, I got to interview Elton John on a phone call from Paris. People are going, "Were you nervous talking to Elton John?" I said, "No, done McCartney. How bad can it be?" And so then something happened in 2001. I was on the air during the 9/11 attack.
Yeah.
And the company made a decision at that time that it is not appropriate to play music. And by that time, my partner of almost 16 years, he had left the show, and it was just me and a microphone for 4 hours in a national crisis.
Wow.
And so I really had to do a lot of preparation and planning to get through those 4 hours every day for over 3 weeks until we were able to go back to some kind of normalcy, very gently, I should add. It was a very tender time. And so I learned at that point that I could do this. I can do interviews, I can do them well, and I can carry a certain amount of time. A few years after that, my wife wound up in politics and was elected to our state legislature for 4 terms.
Right.
So I was asked periodically to fill in on political talk shows, and I'd line up people that I knew through her up at the Capitol and talk about what was going on in the state. And of course, it wasn't as divisive as things are right now. So it was interesting. And, again, I proved to myself more than anything that, yeah, I could do this. So I was still doing a pop show in the mornings up till 2012. And then I decided when the format of that station changed and that ended that, I said, I don't want to get up at 4:30 in the morning anymore. It's killing me. I'm getting older and it's harsh. So I got hired to do middays at a station, an oldie station in town. Being an oldie myself by that time, said, yeah, I can do that. But I used their studios to start Extreme Genes. And the talk station in the building with iHeartRadio was the first one to pick up the show. And a few months later, we wound up with a couple of stations in Alabama. And at its peak, it was over 60 some odd stations around the United States. And we were on in Boston, Washington, Atlanta, Dallas, Las Vegas, Denver, Salt Lake.
Wow.
Not always at the same time because stations change formats and things come and go. I would edit those shows for radio and then we would make it a podcast. After 10 and a half years in December, I pulled the plug on the radio side because I was just finding at this stage of my life to have a deadline every week to come up with a new show. It was just time to make a change. 485 episodes, that's enough. But I'm still doing occasional podcasts.
I mean, what are you going to do with all of this newfound spare time that you've got?
Well, I've been retired from full-time radio now for 3.5 years, so I've been doing tons of research during this time anyway, even with the radio show when it was going on.
Right.
It's just that I found at that point with the deadlines, it prevented me more than anything from traveling. And I love to travel. I've got a daughter and son-in-law and 3 grandkids that live in Germany. So they're only going to be there another year and a half or so. So we've been over a couple times, and we're actually going over in 2 months to see them some more and tour around Northwest Europe.
Okay.
We're going to go to Amsterdam this time as well. But before, when we'd have, we want to take 3 weeks or a month, which is kind of what you hope to be able to do in retirement. It was a lot of work to prepare to cover those shows while I'm gone. And then when you come back to try to, get right back in the groove and move quickly. So travel, I think, is the number one thing that's going to benefit the most from this.
Nice. What keeps you motivated with researching family history?
Stories more than anything.
Okay.
Because most of my lines are pretty mature at this point. I am intending to write a novel that I'm well along with on this great-grandfather, the veteran fireman we talked about. He had a very colorful life. He wasn't necessarily the most admirable person in my line, but he is certainly, to me, the most interesting. He was involved with Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed and the corrupt era at that time.
Okay.
And then, of course, he was a merchant. He had 2 brothers who were involved with the Academy of Music, which, if you've seen the series The Gilded Age, which was created by the same man who created Downton Abbey,
Yep.
You'll see that plays a big role in the storyline. And so I had family connections to that. It's just like all this stuff comes together. It's like, well, this is a novel. So I'm trying to find other things, not only about them personally, but things surrounding them that had to have impacted their lives. So I'm doing a lot of that.
Right.
And I'm also going through and using AI for photographs, for improving them, for colorizing black and white pictures. Love it. It's just so fun to see what you can do now.
Yeah, there's so much at hand. And I guess when you first started researching, could you imagine that we would be able to get so much information or so much research help through our computers? And
Never. Never. There are some things we lost with this, though.
Okay.
Back in the late 80s, I had reached a brick wall with my second great-grandfather, Fisher, in New York. I knew he was from Yorkshire, and I didn't know where.
Okay.
I didn't know who his father was. I didn't really have a clue, and I had literally looked under every rock I could think of. And so I made a decision that I was going to just see what happened to his descendants. Just learn what was the story of the family as a whole and who did what. And he had 6 children that survived to adulthood, and I think 4 or 5 of them had kids that still have descendants today. That's what I learned from it. But back then, you had to do so many things with microfilm and phone calls, and there wasn't email even at that point. So I started kind of developing this technique for myself anyway of pulling forward and looking up obituaries in papers. And, the New York papers for that area would have indexes for those names, and I could go research that. It was very time consuming. And then I remember when I found my first living descendant, who was a third cousin from this person. And I found her phone number through a thing called directory assistance we have over here. You'd call 411, directory assistance, how may I help you? And I don't know what the British version of that would have been, but I'm sure you had one.
Directory inquiries, I think.
Probably something like that. And so she got me the phone number for this lady down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she was delightful. She was in her 80s, happy to hear from me. And she had known her great-grandmother, who had known my great-great-grandparents.
Okay.
And I said, did she ever tell you where he was from? And she said, no, I'd always wished I'd asked her that. And I'm like, oh, so close. She said, but there's a cousin of mine in upstate New York who has a son about your age. I was in my 30s at that point. And he's deep into this stuff. Maybe he can help you. So I got in touch with him. And he had handwritten notes that his great-grandmother, this woman we'd been talking about, had left his mother in the 1930s, named the parents, named where in England they were from, named the parents of great-great-grandmother Fisher's folks, and it was a huge breakthrough.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is amazing. And he and I are still in touch to this day. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to keep doing this technique of finding living people because they might be able to help me. Well, I found another guy in California who'd been a World War II vet, and he had a few pictures, and he sent me copies, and we visited him, and he actually gave me some originals, which are amazing. Single, never married, no kids, no siblings. So when he eventually died, I wound up getting all of his stuff, and I found the Fisher family Bibles from the 1840s, the Bible records he had never told us about.
Wow.
And he had a contract between my great-grandfather and his great-grandfather for the mercantile firm in New York. It was a huge haul. 10 daguerreotypes in his collection. He never told us about any of this stuff.
Gosh.
But back in 1990, he got us in touch with this family in Minnesota. And I wound up flying out there, and they had a portrait of my second great-grandfather that was done in pastels in the 1870s up in the attic. And they had photos of all the Fisher siblings except my great-grandfather, of course. I still took, like I said, another 20 years to find him. But the lesson from that is there are a lot of people who are not into family research, who do not have ancestry accounts. They are not on Family Search. But they have this archive in the attic, an archive in the basement, an archive in the cabinets, things that were passed down. They have nobody to give them to, and they often don't even care that they have these things. They mean nothing to them.
Yeah.
So over many, many years, I have reached out and found many of these people who have given me things and given me, more importantly, information. And many of them are excited to hear what I have to share with them. But I think there's a mindset we get into that, we reach so many more people through Ancestry, and we reach so many more people through Family Search and things like that, that those are the only folks out there that are really going to be able to help us. And so we miss out on these other experiences. The beauty of it is, though, is if you change your mindset and you start using Ancestry and Family Search and the modern tools we now have to find these other people who are out there, to connect with them somehow, and hopefully they'll take your phone call, not thinking that you're a spammer, that you're going to wind up finding some things. And I always offer them far more than they're ever going to offer me. And sometimes maybe they don't have anything, but they'll get me in touch with somebody who they know does have something. And that's, family Bibles and photos more than anything. Right now, our family tree is pretty solid, and I don't expect anybody's going to tell me something I don't already know, but those other things, they mean a lot.
Yeah. That is sage advice, I think. As we research our roots, we inevitably encounter the fascinating stories of good, bad, or just plain ugly relatives. So, with this in mind, it's now time for my guest to pick one of their relatives and tell their life story. So, Scott, who are you going to introduce us to?
Well, I'm going to talk about my half-uncle.
Okay.
Maybe even a couple of them.
Okay.
Their name was Olsen. My mother was a Scandinavian beauty.
Right, okay.
She was a showgirl during the 40s and then wound up as an actress in Hollywood.
Wow.
And then met my musician father. They were both filing for divorces in Reno, and that's how they met, and that's how I came to be.
Well, they had something in common, I guess.
They did. They had a lot in common, entertainment.
Yes.
And so that's why I never thought anything about going into radio was unusual. But a few years back, about 3 years ago, I completed a book during the pandemic on my mother's family during World War II. Mm-hmm. And the reason I was able to do a lot with this is because my mother was a prolific letter writer, and she was a prolific letter saver.
Right.
And so she wrote to a lot of sailors and soldiers, but she also had a lot of family letters from her two brothers who served in the United States Navy in World War II. One of them, Donald, the younger one, served in the Pacific. He was in the Battle of Midway. He was in all the battles otherwise in the roll-up of the islands to the ultimate victory over the Japanese. The other older brother, Harold, he served in the Mediterranean and was part of the first attack in Casablanca and northern Africa. and then in Anzio and in Italy.
Okay.
And also the attack on southern France, which they don't talk much about, that was to help try to draw some of the German forces over there and away from the northern beaches of Normandy and the attack there. And my whole family during that time, my mother was in entertainment at that time, like I said, during the war. These two brothers were in the Navy. Another one signed up with the Army Air Corps. He wanted to be a pilot, but he was much younger and it was late. And the strangest thing happened. He was assigned to go down to Mississippi for training, and he was reading a newspaper in the chow line.
Right.
And he saw a friend of his up ahead who waved to him to come on up and join him in the chow line. And he's reading the newspaper as he goes. And he didn't notice this little 1-foot wall they had there that kind of cordoned off this area around the tent. And he tripped over it. And he messed up his knee. And within a week, it was just huge. And so he wound up over in the hospital there on base. Mm-hmm. And they're draining the knee and draining the knee. It's an infected...
Oh, it sounds nasty.
He wound up in the hospital for 6 months.
Right.
And by the time he got out, it was June of 45, and they just released him on a medical release. And he was disappointed because he felt like he'd let his brothers down because they were doing all the hard lifting in the war. But he wound up going off to college. So that was the three brothers, and then there were two others, one who helped actually with Oppenheimer in one of his facilities down in, he was an older brother who was a builder, so he helped build some of the place down there for the Manhattan Project, and then another one who worked out on the island, what was it, in Midway, before the war started. So we had a lot, and then the other brother who actually helped build airplanes in Los Angeles, among those that were part of the raid on Tokyo in 1942. So they were all involved in all these different things. But I'll talk about Donald a little bit. He was the one who was in the Pacific.
Yeah, okay.
And he heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, while he was outside working on his car in Los Angeles. He was down there working with a man who eventually became his brother-in-law. And he heard on the radio about this, and the very next day, according to my research, he signed up. And I found I actually was able to order through the National Archives his naval records, and they told a lot. And so he signed up and was ultimately assigned to a ship called the USS New Orleans, which was, I believe, was a heavy cruiser. And so it would support some of the other ships in their convoys as they would head off to battle the Japanese. And so he wound up in the Battle of Midway and did well there, survived that just fine. And a short time later, when they were in some other battle, and I'm trying to remember what the island was, a Japanese torpedo came and hit the front of his ship, and 180 some of his shipmates were instantly lost. Ugh. And so the nose of his ship was completely cut off, and nobody knew what had happened exactly at that moment. And I found all kinds of accounts in my research of it written by other people who were on the ship at the time that it seemed to lift into the air and then just settle back down, and people are going, well, what was that? What happened there?
Okay.
And so in the cabin, they're trying to check the different parts of the ship, and they weren't getting any response from the front. Somebody went up and almost fell over the edge that was now there.
Wow. Sounds like absolute carnage.
Yeah. So they wound up puttering their way over to a nearby island, going backwards, I believe, trying not to bring water in through the front, and beached the ship and took trees and tried to hide it because they didn't want Japanese planes to spot it, to attack it. And they used wood that they were able to find there and actually build a temporary block. It was like a wall on the front of this ship. And they had to clean the remains out from so many of the shipmates. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And there are photographs of this time.
Oh, sounds horrific.
And then with an escort, they had to go, I think it was 1,000 miles to get to Sydney, Australia, which was the nearest base where they could have their ship repaired. And they were scared to death that a Japanese submarine might spot them at some point, and that would be the end of it. So the whole way in, it was a big problem.
Oh, gosh.
And at one point, they decided that the ship wasn't going to be able to handle it. It was going too slow. So they turned it around, and they were trying to go in reverse 1,000 miles, but they found that it was causing great problems for the engine to do that. It wasn't made for that, so they turned it back around after a couple of 100 miles and continued on. So they got a break. A new little snub nose was created for this ship back there. And Donald and his team then went back to Washington State, Bremerton, Washington, where they had a naval base there. And they thought they were going to get a great big vacation from all their trials. But nope, there was already a nose waiting for that ship all ready for them. And as soon as they got there, they threw that thing on. So they only got a week or two off.
Oh, my goodness.
And during that time, he had been married, and he had a stepson with this child down in Los Angeles. So he went down and to see them, and then went back out to sea. And the story is basically she sent him a Dear John letter and broke up with him, said she wanted a divorce in the middle of it. And so at some point he was back and went AWOL and didn't return to the ship from his leave for a month. And so, of course, he was going to now face a court-martial for that, but they really didn't want to lose experienced seamen in the midst of the war with the Japanese.
Yep.
So they sentenced him basically to work in this area on shore for 6 months, keep your nose clean, and they sent him right back to the USS New Orleans. So they were part of the wrap-up of the war in Japan. He got 10 battle stars, and he did not get a dishonorable discharge. So he was happy about that, but he had a lot of mental problems as a result of all the things he'd seen, what he'd been through.
I'm not surprised.
He had trouble with relationships. He cried very easily. I think today we would call that battle fatigue. And in 1968, he took his own life, which I still consider him a casualty of World War II, even though it was 25 years later.
Very much so. What was Donald's rank upon the ship?
Boy, what was it? It wasn't very high,
Okay.
But he worked in the engine room because he had been an engineer. So he worked in the engine room on the ship.
Right. To go for such a long distance to Australia to find your safety and find your repair, it's just inconceivable idea.
Yeah, it was insane. So Donald had his experiences. Harold had his over in the Mediterranean. He was a completely different type. He wasn't as high-strung as Donald was. He was everybody's favorite uncle. He had no kids, and he adored all of us. We all thought we were his favorites. And he was soft-spoken, big, gentle giant, big man. He'd been a boxer in the 1930s and actually went to go pro at one point, but he broke his thumb just as World War II broke out, and he went right back into the Navy. He'd been in there from like 1935 all through the Depression because you couldn't find work.
No, I guess not.
And so he signed up for that, got out, broke his thumb, went right back in, and talked about being in the Atlantic at the time they heard the news that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And so he wound up being sent out on a different ship to the Mediterranean. But he would talk about, we'd fire on the beaches. And he said, no, we'd shoot at those German planes when they'd fly over. But I found other accounts from his shipmates that talked about how they had to dodge these bombs coming from German airplanes on them, to avoid being destroyed. And he so downplayed the danger. And maybe that was his safety mechanism in his memory. We just shoot at these planes like there was never any real danger. But
yeah,
his shipmates were terrified. It was very difficult. So those were a couple of them. But Donald, I have always felt a certain compassion for. His son is in his 70s. We're very close cousins, and I think he has appreciated that book on the family in World War II more than anybody, because it really told him his father's story and helped him to understand him, because he was born after the war, and he knew that his dad had problems, but now he fully understands why. I think there's a lot more forgiveness for a lot of people when they see something like this, if they understand the root cause. And my father-in-law did the same thing before I ever met my wife. And she was able to forgive him right away because she understood many of the circumstances that led to that pain in his life that he felt couldn't be solved in any other way. But it's fascinating to study human beings and what makes us all tick.
Do you think that Donald and Harold were close? Because they sound like they were quite different characters.
They were very different characters, but all of the brothers, let's see, I think there were 6 brothers and 3 sisters in my mom's family. There were 2 mothers in this. The first one had the 7 kids. She died young, unexpectedly. And then my grandfather married my grandmother, who had my mom and the younger uncle who joined the Air Corps. So, but they all were raised as one family. And nobody ever thought about the half-brother, half-sister thing or anything like that. But they were all very close, and they all loved each other, and they were a very, I would just say they loved good times. They were involved in a lot of things. Boy, I'll tell you what, they married a lot of people.
Oh, okay.
There's one sister who married 7 or 8 times. I'm not sure how many were actual marriages or just lovers. My mother had buried 2 husbands and divorced 2 husbands.
Wow.
I could go on and on. I mean, it's a long list. I've never been able to fully satisfy myself that it's entirely complete.
Wow, that sounds like quite a complicated tree.
Oh, boy.
Well, thank you very much for telling me about Donald Olsen. But I think it's now time for you to face the brick wall. Brick walls are very annoying, but they are an inevitable part of our research. And their arrival can be sudden and frustrating, lasting hours, months, years, or even decades. Therefore, it's now the turn of you, dear listeners, to see if you can help my guest to turn their brick wall to brick dust. So, Scott, what have you got for us?
Wow. This has been a difficult one. I've been thinking about this. I got a couple in mind. I've had a second grade that he's a triple brick wall, and I'm kind of convinced that that's not the best way to use this amazing opportunity you're giving me. So I'm going to go with a man named James Stocks.
Okay.
James Stocks married Catherine Margaret Tench at St. Martin's in the Fields in Westminster, the 7th of June in 1802.
Yeah.
They had 5 children. And then I found through digitized newspapers that in 1818, James abandoned the family.
Oh, okay.
And it told us quite a bit of information about him in this notice. And of course, as you well know, Andrew, that left quite a burden on the churches when somebody would leave the responsibility of their family like that.
Yeah.
And so they were putting out a notice in the paper to try to find where he had gone so that they could track him down, and they didn't have the burden of taking care of Catherine and her children. And so it was quite a problem. Let me read to you what the London Morning Advertiser of October 9th, 1818 said. Parish of St. James, Westminster, whereas James Stocks, a native of Scotland, by trade a shoemaker, hath deserted his wife named Catherine and 5 children in August last, who are become chargeable to the parish of St. James, Westminster. The said James Stocks, at the time of deserting his wife and family, lodged at number 16, I believe it's Leicester Street. He lately worked for Mr. Pratt in Clipstone Street. Whoever will give information to the churchwardens and overseers of the poor of the parish of St. James, Westminster, so that he can be brought to justice, shall receive a reward of 2 guineas. So, Andrew, I don't know of any rescinding of this offer. There may be 2 guineas available from St. James, Westminster for anybody who finds him.
Ooh.
So
I'm not sure that that's going to be available. But if it is, then the interest on it could be quite fantastic.
You might be right. It says the said James is 39 years old, about 5 feet 6 inches high, fair complexion, dark hair, dark eyes, and round visage, and had on, when he went away, a drab-colored greatcoat, dark-striped waistcoat, fustian trousers, worsted stockings, and shoes. So if you see him, that's what he looks like.
He might look a bit different now.
I think you might be right. So if you go back 39 years from 1818, we're looking at 1779 in Scotland. And I have gone through to try to figure out, there are some James Stockses from Scotland that are from around that time period, but I find they either died or were married to someone else or went somewhere. So that was really the last big clue, which I thought was a great one. And I, knowing that your listeners are in the UK, would probably have a better knowledge of how to move forward with that than I would. So I'd be thrilled if somebody were able to find James Stocks and I could continue that line.
Well, I mean, that's a wonderful description that they gave in that article, because obviously they're trying to find him.
Yeah, there's real clues.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of information you don't tend to find anywhere else, certainly for that time period.
Yeah, it was a good find.
How are you spelling Stocks?
Stocks.
And you said that he was allegedly born about 1779, somewhere in Scotland.
Allegedly. And there are two of his daughters lived to the age in the United States where there's mention either in their death certificate or in a census of where the parents were born.
Okay.
There was mention that the father was from England, but there were two other mentions that he was from Scotland. So, and then we have this newspaper. So I'm going with the newspaper. It makes the most sense that it would be Scotland. That was certainly closest to the circumstance. The information certainly came directly from his wife. I tend to believe that more than something that came 70 or 80 years later to muddy the waters as far as the picture goes.
Okay, well, let's hope that the listeners can help you find a clue for this.
Oh, I'd be appreciative. That would be incredible.
If they can help you with this, they can head over to familyhistoriespodcast.com, where they can read this episode's show notes. And they can also send us an email at hello@familyhistoriespodcast.com, and we'll pass that straight along to Scott. Now, whilst the listeners scurry off to try to hunt down some answers, it's possible that I might be able to help you here, but you're going to need to follow me through to the garage.
All right.
Here we are.
Oh, man, look at all this stuff.
This is my secret time machine.
I had one of these as a kid.
What? Oh, you mean that bit? I think you must be confused, because that's a piece of highly calibrated scientific equipment. Its likeness is merely coincidental. Yes, that's it. I'll just hand it over.
I wonder what all this stuff does.
Well, as I said, this is all part of a fully functional, scientifically calibrated secret time machine. Oh, and that's Shandor Patofi.
Hello.
Okay. So, where are we going to travel back in time to?
Well, Shandor and I will stay right here, but if you'd like to take a seat over there, I thought you might like to see if you can solve your brick wall for yourself. You know, back in time, first hand. We can set the time coordinates and zap you back there. But you need to remind me of the date and the place.
That sounds fun. All right, June 7th, 1802, St. Martin in the Fields, Westminster, London, England, UK.
Okay. Right.
There we go. All set.
Hey, Andrew,
Yeah?
how do I get back?
Glad you asked. You need this temporal beacon. Just press the big button on the top when you're ready to come home.
You mean this one?
That's the very one. Right. Here we go. Scott Fisher, thank you, goodbye, and good luck.
He is in Buenos Aires.
He's what, where?
Buenos Aires Lighthouse.
Oh, lighthouse? Where's...
In Antarctica.
Oh, no. Oh. Well, I hope he really does have extreme genes. The Family Histories podcast was presented and produced by me, Andrew Martin. My guest was the brilliant Scott Fisher, with John Spike as Shandor Patofi. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to leave us a review or share this episode with your friends. Thank you for listening. Approximately no family historians were harmed in the making of this podcast.